This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Jay-Z Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. So get ready to rock.
It's not something that is a must. You don't have to have parallel compression for a track to sound great. It's a very creative way of mixing. And my philosophy very often is less is more. And so unless I want to get creative or unless I'm trying to get to a place where the direct, so to speak, signal is not taking me, I don't need to do any extra trickery, less is more.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. If you feel like the fast pace of computer tech has made your studio Mac obsolete, then think again. OWC is your personal studio tech for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs perfect for recording and mixing. Why ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with the Mac you've already got? Learn how to supercharge your studio and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC.com so that you can focus on making great music. If you want a digital audio workstation that will give life to your music, from sketching a new idea to composing, editing, mixing, and mastering a finished record, then you want Studio One from PreSonus. Studio One is easy to use with intuitive drag-and-drop simplicity, making it great for beginners yet flexible and powerful for experienced producers. Whether creating beats, recording a band, or composing a blockbuster film soundtrack, you will find everything you need to create your masterpiece. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstar, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Marc Urselli, a 6-time Grammy-nominated and 3-time Grammy Award-winning engineer, producer, mixer, sound designer, and front-of-house engineer. Marc Urselli works with many artists from around the world. He's worked with U2, Foo Fighters, Nick Cave, Lou Reed, Sting, Keith Richards, Kesha, and Laurie Anderson, to name just a few, and scores of other amazing artists performing rock, pop, metal, jazz, experimental, avant-garde, new music, urban, and electronica and classical. Marc also composes music for film and television, creates sound design for commercials, and mixes audio for film and television, as well as mixing more than half a dozen movie soundtracks. Born in Switzerland, he moved to Italy and opened his first commercial recording facility at 17 years old, later moving to New York City, where he currently resides and works as chief house engineer for the historic and legendary recording studio EastSide Sound. Marc works in the highest caliber studios worldwide, including Village Recorders, Capitol Sound, East West LA, Sunset Sound, Sears Sound, Flux, and Grouse Lodge in Dublin, and many others. Marc has learned a great deal about recording and mixing and teaches online and from the stage as well. And I've included a great clip of him teaching for Sonic Scoop from the stage, and I'm excited to learn more about mixing professionally for multiple genres. A big shout out and a thank you also to our mutual friend Rudy Rupshan for making our introduction a while back. We're finally here on the show, so please welcome Marc Urselli to Recording Studio Rockstars. Marc, are you ready to rock?
I am ready.
Dude, it's great to have you here on the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to set some context, of course, we should let our listeners know that we are, of course, doing this during the time of quarantine. Hopefully, and this is coming out much later, so hopefully we'll be looking back, listening to this episode and thinking that was a kooky time some while ago.
We can only hope.
We can only hope. But I think you were mentioning that you're actually joining us from London right now. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I live between New York and London, and I was on tour when the border started closing, and so I was on tour in Europe, so I just decided to stay in Europe.
Okay, wow. And then now are you sort of situated in a home studio environment during this quarantine time?
Yeah, I have a home studio both in New York and in London, although my real studio, EastSide Sound, is in New York.
Yeah, it's a beautiful looking studio. I've been able to see some of the pictures online. Would you tell us a little bit more about, who you are, and maybe give us a brief background into how you got from, kind of a short timeline of how you got interested in this stuff and ended up where you are now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you've pretty much said it all in the introduction, but to expand upon that a little bit, basically, I was one of those geeks that wanted to record every rehearsal of my band when I was 15 or 16. Oh, yeah. And I started buying more recording equipment. I started with a mixing console. Of course, at the time it was analog, and I think it was only 12 channels or something like that. And then I bought and I was recording from the console into a cassette tape recorder. Then I wanted to multi-track, so I bought my first Fostex X26 4-track cassette multi-track recorder. And then I wanted to take it more seriously, and I bought a 12 or 14 tracks. I think it was 12 audio tracks and a SMPTE track, a Kai recorder that did record on these kind of tapes that looked like video tapes, like VHS tapes. Then from there, I went to I believe a Fostex S16, which was a reel-to-reel half-inch 16-track. And then from there, I made the jump to Pro Tools. All of this that I mentioned for the gearheads out there happened in my first studio, which I opened in my parents' basement in southern Italy when I was living there. I opened the studio when I was 17. I held on to it until I was 21 or 22. And then I moved to New York pretty much after that.
It was pretty impressive memory to just hold on to all the model numbers like that.
Yeah, well, they're the kind of thing that it's like your childhood things that you remember because you've done so much research on them, and you've come about on them, you learned on them, you've become who you are today on them. So yeah, they're kind of like historic in that sense for me.
Was the Fostex, was that a cassette, the original 4-track?
The original 4-track was my first 4-track. Yeah, was a cassette, like a regular cassette. Mm-hmm. Then the next thing was like VHS shaped cassette tapes. Yeah, the Akai, right? The Akai. And then I went to reel and then to Pro Tools.
Okay, yeah. Those Akais really sounded quite good. They were really fantastic piece of equipment because you had the cassette or these, the videotapes you could put in there, and it had a built-in mixer and a console and everything, EQ, and everything was all in one, wasn't it?
No, that's it. You must be talking about something else. The one I had, which I don't remember the exact model of, was this maybe 5 or 6 rack unit tall rack mountable machine. And you would just insert the tape in the front and you had meters. But then all the mixing and EQing I was doing on an analog console, which I bought for my first professional recording studio.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, when I built a studio in my parents' basement, I bought an Argentini, it's called. Argentini was the last name of this guy, Livio Argentini. I don't know if he's still alive, but he used to build all the audio equipment for Rai television, RAI, which is the Italian. It's like the BCC or the NBC in Italy, basically, the main Italian TV channel. So he used to make custom audio stuff for them, and he made this beautiful 32-channel inline console that I bought from a friend who had a studio and was upgrading to a bigger console. And that moment was actually what changed my life in a way, because one day he told me, I have this, and I'd recorded at this guy's studio with my bands, and we were friends, and he told me he was selling his console. Would I know anyone who would want to buy it? And at first I was like, no, I mean, why would I know somebody who has that much money to spend on something that's longer than my bed and is going to take up that much room? And I think only later that night I was staring at the ceiling thinking, you know what? I'm the guy that wants to buy it.
That's great. That's a nice transition in life when you sort of like, when it clicks that you should make that bold move.
Exactly. Yeah. It was very much a transition, because up until time it was, the angst, youth type of period of my life when you're 16 and you don't quite know what you're going to do with life, and life is about to get serious on you and you just don't know,
Well, that's pretty impressive. I mean, at 17, I certainly didn't know what I wanted to do. Probably took me almost another 10 years before I was ready to make a decision like that.
No, I hear you, but I have to say that when you grow up in a place like Southern Italy in the 90s, there was a lot of, I don't know if I was ahead of other people my age, but I was already very politicized, very interested in politics. I was going to squats, and mainly because of music was the entrance into that world. But because of music, punk hardcore, that was the scene back in the days that I was in, the do-it-yourself scene. Through that, I got into distributors, labels, things like that. But when you're in that scene, you're around, very political ideas about things. And so you kind of grow up quicker, I guess. So
what was your instrument?
I studied piano, and I was playing keys in my band at the time. Okay. But then, I kind of decided I want to become a sound engineer.
Keys, the most punk rock of all instruments, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why I loved Faith No More so much, because they were the only band at the time that was making keyboards cool,
Right.
I never played punk hardcore. I was in the scene because, like I said, it was a scene that was very conducive to dealing with labels, to the whole do-it-yourself aesthetics, etc. Mm-hmm. But I was always more into rock and metal, and that's the stuff I played in my band. We had a crossover band, made a couple of demos, etc.
Now, do you feel like keys have made a comeback?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think keys in the rock world, unless it's Deep Purple or things like that. In the rock and metal world, they're just not as cool as guitars,
Yeah.
But obviously there's many other subgenres, the whole electronic side of things, where keys are very, very important. And I actually, after my punk hardcore period, I very heavily got into industrial and electronic music, and I formed a band called the Memory Lab at the time, where I was basically making all the music on keyboards, on samplers and stuff like that. And, we wanted to sound like Nine Inch Nails or the Young Gods or The Crooks. Those were my favorite bands at the time. I was very much into that scene, so much so that I started a fanzine at the time, which still exists today, but in the webzine format, called Chained LK. Which is all about electronic, industrial, dark wave, synth pop, all of those genres.
And tell us the name of that fanzine again.
It's called Chain DLK.
Chain DLK. Okay.
Yeah, .com is the website. It still gets like 25,000 visitors per month reading reviews and stuff like that. I'm still sort of the editor-in-chief. I just don't have much time to write myself anymore.
Yeah.
So I have writers that basically receive the CDs and get to keep them in exchange for writing reviews about them and helping the scene with support in that sense.
Well, that's very cool. That's really a fascinating backstory to how you got to where you are now. You want the critical details from your microphone to get through to your recording, and the Spectra 1964 101 amplifier provides just that. With unequaled headroom, low noise, and a linear output, irrespective of transient audio peaks. Used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, and The Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, and John Lennon, Spectra 1964 brings that same incredible sound to your studio with the new STX 600 mic pre with built-in comp limiter. Start making classic records again at Spectra1964.com. Are you sick of microphones that make your music sound harsh and brittle? The new Amethyst mic by Jay-Z Microphones brings you a rich, warm tone with perfect detail using the golden capsule technology. Resulting from 30 years of microphone design, the Amethyst is hand-built using carefully selected parts with Class A discrete circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and an advanced shock mount to make sure your recordings sound awesome. This is my voice on the Amethyst right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst mic at jzmic.com. Well, so tell us a little bit more about your interaction with a console. So I've seen at your studio now you have I couldn't tell what kind of console is that. Is that a Harrison or something like that?
Very correct. And you're in Nashville, right?
Yeah,
So you know
yeah.
Nashville. Yeah. That's a Harrison Series 10 made in Nashville by a company called GLW Harrison. It's a analog console with digital recall. So it's the best of both worlds in the sense that it has no ADDAs. The sound goes in analog and comes out analog, never gets converted, but you can apply all the transformations that you would on a digital console. So you can, and everything is automatable, not just the faders like with flying faders, but you can automate inserts, sends, EQs, and you can automate all of that stuff either as a recall or on the timeline. So you can do a real mix like you would on a digital console where every single thing is automatable, but the sound never gets converted. Harrison was very much ahead of their times. And I love that console. I've pretty much grown up on that because that's the console EastSide Sound had when I started there as an intern in 1999.
Yeah, Harrison. Oh, wait, you interned where? Not at Harrison. Where was the place?
No, I interned at EastSide Sound, which is the studio right. that I now run as a chief engineer in New York.
Yeah, so Harrison is very cool. They're right here in Nashville, and I've been to the factory. In fact, we've had Ben Loftus on the podcast early on to talk about Harrison. And then another guest on the show, Craig Alvin, I think is also a series, maybe a series 10, or I'm not sure if there's a different model.
Yeah, there's a series 12 after that.
And that might be his, yeah.
Yeah, but series 10, I think, is late 80s. Yeah.
Well, very cool. So what are some smart ways to interact with a console that has automation and, Pro Tools at the same time? Are there some automation features that you find very useful and others where you're like, nah, just use the ones that are in the computer?
That's a very good question because actually my working method has changed throughout the years. When I first learned to use the Harrison during my internship, late 90s, early 2000s, I was automating every single thing. And at the time, a lot of the recording I was doing was still to tape 24 track 2-inch. Mm-hmm. And so you would do things like, for example, before the song starts, there's hiss coming from the tape. And so you would mute all the channels and then use the automation on the console to unmute all the channels at the top of the tune. So it was completely clean and no hiss. And then, of course, you do all the moves, all the fader moves and whatnot. As time evolved and, we started using Pro Tools instead of tape machines, a lot of that stuff is faster on Pro Tools. Say, for example, the client says, I want all the vocals on all the choruses to be 2 dBs up, for example. So that's much faster on Pro Tools because you can see where the choruses are. You grab your automation line, you pull it up. Whereas on the console, you'd have to listen to every one of the choruses and push that fader up in what is called update mode, fader update mode. So yeah. My methodology has definitely changed, and so now it's where I'm almost at the other end, where basically I do almost all the automation in Pro Tools, but what I still use the recalls, the Harrison for is the recalls, because I can set my mix on the console, meaning faders, EQs. If I want to use dynamic section on the console, I'll do it, although I don't do that very often, but mostly fader and EQs. And then that's my starting point. And then I do my automation in Pro Tools, but that's my starting point. And I create a different starting point for every song. Or if it's a jazz project where it's pretty much the same sounds.
Okay, so I think I understand what you're saying, and the console gives you that fast ability to mute things, unmute things, move faders around, and start to get a balance for a mix, and get sort of a static mix going. And then when you're at that point, plus you've got the EQ and the routing. And then when you're at that point, then you can just go over to the computer to do some of the automation where there's, smaller adjustments to everything.
That's almost entirely correct. I basically do almost everything that's automated on the computer on Pro Tools, but I get a static mix on the console so that I can use the summing, the analog summing of the console, as well as the EQs from the console. And basically, I have a recall. And the importance of that is that I can reopen that song a month later with a client in 30 seconds because I load the Pro Tools file and I load the console file, and that's my starting point. If I have any outboard, obviously I have to recall the outboard manually, but otherwise everything is there.
Now, I imagine that you're using totally different software for the console than you are for Pro Tools in your sessions. Is it the same computer that's talking to both? And are there any, I know your situation is very unique compared to somebody else with a different setup, but maybe you've learned some good things about how to keep things organized when you're like, all right, I need to hold on to this Pro Tools session. And then I've got these weirdo photos I took and some notes and maybe also the recall file from the console. Any tips there?
Yeah. I mean, I'll answer that in two different sections. To answer your question about the two computers, there are two computers. One is my main Pro Tools computer, and then the other one is the computer that only serves to store the files of the console. Interestingly, I'll tell you that Harrison Series 10 was the first ever console to ever work on a Mac. Before that, all the consoles, like if you go to old Neves, which we had one of those at EastSide Sound, was all on PCs. Harrison was the first company to use a Mac, which was groundbreaking. Now, the downside of that is that at the time, 1989 or whatever it was, there was no PCI, there was NuBus. And so the connection between the Harrison and the old Mac is a NuBus card, which means we have to use an old Mac, a Mac 2FX. And so we bought several Mac 2FXs from eBay to have spare parts. And it runs on OS 7, which is super, super slow and cumbersome. But really, it doesn't matter because we turn on the computer in the morning, and all we do is save a file at the end of the day or during the day, and that's all that computer does. So it doesn't need any DSP, it doesn't do any audio processing whatsoever. And to answer your second part of your question about organization, I'm very, very, very organized. So on the Mac that saves the files for the console, I have folders that are divided by year and then by client name and project name, so I can search by year, et cetera, always go back on and those are backed up to, if you remember, zip drives. We have a zip drive through SCSI connected to that Mac 2FX. So they're backed up to a zip drive and to a second hard drive on the Mac. And then, of course, on the main real modern computer, a lot of thinking goes into backing off. So there's multiple drives, multiple copies, usually also a cloud backup of at least a Pro Tools file, so that basically all the audio files are in two hard drives in different locations, and the PTX file is also in the cloud.
What are some smart ways to have it on two hard drives in different locations? Do you have to have both hard drives in the studio, copy it, and then take a hard drive to a new place? Or are you actually able to do things like use Ethernet networks and link up two drives, even though they're in totally different places?
Yeah, no, I haven't gotten that far because obviously if you're talking about different locations, then you're talking about the internet, and that's way too slow for the amount of data that we create. Mm-hmm. So I simply have multiple sets of drives that have, and that's true for, if it's a recurring client that I work with a lot, then there's multiple drives for just that client. And then there's multiple drives for the one-time clients. And what I usually do is during the session, I have a software running called Sync Folders Pro, which you can get on the App Store, where that basically does an incremental backup. So after every take, I press that button to do an incremental backup. So I know that at any time the computer were to explode in flames, there's still that project on two hard drives at least. And then when the whole project is over, then I archive it to a third project, and I take that third drive offsite.
Okay, that's very cool. I like hearing about new apps like that. I'm using something called ChronoSync, which
Yeah, it's very similar to ChronoSync. ChronoSync is one of the softwares I was looking at. I did a lot of research because I used to use a software called Sync, spelled SYNK, and they stopped making it. That was my favorite, and I was looking for one that does incremental backups in the background without me having to press a button, so that there's no human interaction. It's always running in the background. It always does it. And Sync Folders Pro did do that. And that's why I chose that over ChronoSync. But whereas on ChronoSync, I think you have to schedule it.
Yeah, it's a little bit complex. Sometimes the backup options seem like they're designed for some big corporate, headquarters.
Yeah.
Doing a million computers, and you're like, I just want to take this folder, this one main drive or this one folder or whatever, and make sure it's duplicated somewhere. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to do what you just described, there's one called Synchronize X, which is super easy to use, or Synchronize Pro X, maybe it's called. And I've used that in other studios. That literally does what you say, one folder to another folder, or one drive to another drive. And it's very basic, but it works. And if you want more options, then you go with ChronoSync or Sync Folders Pro.
Okay, very cool. Great takeaways. Thank you. Let's see here. So you've got the backup, and then you also said you were doing cloud backup too. So what is it called? Backblaze. I know that was one company that did cloud backup. Any other tips for doing a smart cloud backup?
Yeah, I mean, I do two things. I use one called Crash Plan, which is like the Backblaze that you mentioned, which runs in the background and does incremental backups of everything that's on my computer. Although because it's the internet, it's not fast enough to keep up with the audio data. So what I do is I also save the PTX files on my iCloud storage, simply because the iCloud is in the Finder. It like shows up as a folder, and so I can just drag and drop stuff in there.
Yeah.
And I only do it for the PTX because otherwise I'd have to buy gazillions of terabytes of iCloud storage to do audio, and it would be too slow to sync up. But that way, I know that if something were to happen at any time, there's a Pro Tools file somewhere, and then there's going to be a third backup offsite that has all the audio files.
Yeah, great tips. All right, well, let's go back to talking about this hybrid mix setup and some of the things that you've learned about mixing in the computer. Now, you're using Pro Tools primarily for mixing?
Yeah, only Pro Tools for recording and mixing.
Okay, great. Can you talk to us a bit about what it means to mix with a template, and why do we want to know about things like mixing with a template?
Yeah, sure. The template that I use and that you've talked about in the introduction in that Sonic Scoop lesson that I did online is something that I've created and have been updating and working on for years and years and years. I constantly make some tweaks to it and save it as a new version of the template. It basically allows me to start from a very comfortable starting point with any mix that I'm doing. And it's got sub buses for things that I would normally sub bus, like drums, bass, guitars, keys, horns, winds, etc., etc. It's already ready for parallel compression if I want to do it. It's already ready for 5.1 mixing if I need to do it. All of that it's already ready to create multiple outputs of mixes, less compressed or no compressed for the mastering engineer, more compressed for the client. All of that is basically pre-made and ready to go, so that I can just import that and I'm ready to mix. I have to say though, I don't use that template all the time. I'm only using that when I'm mixing in the box, because if I'm mixing in the studio on the analog digital hybrid setup that I have at EastSide, then I just do a mix like you normally would. I send all the outputs to all the channels on the console and I mix like that.
If you're ready to upgrade your studio to the famous sound of API's large format consoles, then you're ready for the Box, a small format console featuring the same analog circuitry and original 2520 op-amp design that has made API famous for 50 years. Record through 8 world-class mic pre-channels, mix through 24 smooth-as-glass faders, and blend mics, analog effects, and parallel compression at the speed of electrons rather than the speed of your computer latency. Upgrade your home studio to legendary status with The Box from APIaudio.com. I think most of us are using a in-the-box setup Pro Tools or any other DAW. So it's definitely exciting for us to talk about ways to make that work. And watching your presentation where you talked about setting up this template and, you pull it up and it's basically... It looks like, when you look at the screen for the first time and you see a template, it might look like audio tracks at the top, and then it might look like a whole lot of lines across the screen because it's so many aux returns and master faders and things like that. When you save a template, what are some smart ways to, let's just jump to the finish line. We've got a template. It's pretty good. We want to save it. We want to be able to reuse it. What are the smart ways to do that? Should we just start a new song and then sort of import from the last song we did? Or do you take this template and sort of select only the template part of your session and then continuously sort of save that to a new place? Or how does that work?
What I do, and which is actually a mistake that I made on that Sonic Scoop presentation that I hereby correct, is what I do is I open my Pro Tools session that I'm about to mix. And the first thing that I do, which I forgot to do on that Sonic Scoop, is I delete the output and bus output routings in the I/O setup of Pro Tools. By doing that, all your outputs default to no output and you have no routing going on whatsoever. So that then when I import the template, all my routing is comes from the template and there's no previous outward route or output routing of any kind. That's really the trick, and it's something I forgot to do there. And basically, my template lives as a Pro Tools file. I don't even save it as a template file. I know that Pro Tools has a way to do that, but I don't see a reason for it. That's more when you're wanting to record and starting from the same place. But I just have a Pro Tools file and I import all the tracks from that. By importing all the tracks from the template, all the output and bus routings come with it. And so then you're ready to go.
So, okay. So, that reminding us about the I/O settings, that's really crucial because it's one of those things where we keep getting bit in the ass in the studio where you're working on a session, then you go look in the I/O and you're like, what's all this stuff? Why is this look all screwy?
Exactly.
And it's because, some client brought in a session and we just opened it right up and started working and then...
Yeah,
right?
and that's what I forgot to do in the Sonic Scoop presentation. What's also interesting about that, and you see me, if you look carefully, you see me on the Sonic Scoop be like, have the question mark over my head, like, why is this not happening the way I'm used to seeing it? And it's because by forgetting to delete it beforehand, your new output routings that you're importing from your template go to the bottom of whatever was there previously. Whereas if you delete everything first, my first bus output, which is drums, my drum submix, is at the very top of my output list, of my bus output list. And so... And then another cool thing happens is that if you want to use buses in your mix, you can, like regular buses that you haven't pre-made, if you leave those set to 128 buses, which is the default, your this is very specific to Pro Tools, so
yeah, that's okay. Most of our listeners are using Pro Tools.
Yeah. So if you leave your default 128 buses there and you import your template that has all the other buses, when you go to a track's output and you select bus, you'll see bus A and bus B, I believe it says. And when you go to bus A, it's all the 128 buses. And when you go to bus B, it's all your named buses like drum space that you've imported. And so everything is super neat and comes out, looks perfect when you open it.
That's great. So, and the beauty, of course, is that when you're setting up the routing, you might open the session and it might have all the audio tracks that somebody sent you to mix, or that you brought in, dragged in and created a mix from. And then because there's no outputs, they're all defaulted to just simply no output?
Correct, which is exactly what I want. That way I can listen and open one track at a time, like I would on an analog console, where you push up one fader at the time. If I don't do that, and then I'm hearing things that I don't want to hear. I might be working on the kick drum and suddenly a guitar or a vocal comes in because there's still some output buses floating around.
Yeah, or worse yet, something was accidentally still routed to an output and starts sneaking into a bounce at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
I like starting from fresh, from scratch. So when I open a session that a client sent me, I do that, which I just described previously, and I do other things like remove all the plugins, and etc. Whatever I want to do, so I can start from fresh. I wish Pro Tools had a way to automate that and create some kind of, snapshot kind of thing. And but they don't. So I just do those things manually.
Well, these are great tips, though. So thank you for that. And then you can just simply go into the bus routing. Well, let's see. So then you would start with this no IOs. You'd have the audio in the session, and then you'd import your mix IO settings, or you just simply import the tracks from your mix IO, and that would bring in the mix IO settings with it, right?
Correct. Yeah, I import the tracks from my template, and that brings in all the mix IO, all the
great.
outputs and the physical outputs.
And then you can just go to the drums, and you can select all your drums and just say, make all these outputs the drum bus, and then that's going to send it to your routing lower in the session, which also goes to the outputs.
Correct. And that'll be the first thing I hear, because everything else was set to no output.
Okay. Give us a brief overview of what some useful routing is. I mean, like what sort of instruments make sense to group together and have separate buses for?
Well, the way I group instruments is in view of the fact that clients might ask for stems. And when they ask for stems, what they usually want is the drums, the bass, the guitars, the keys. So basically, with that in mind, I've created drums, bass, guitar, keys, horns, strings, lead vocals, background vocals. And then from those, I have submixes of those submixes that will be ready to create instrumental, a cappella, and TV track. And everything, again, is part of my template. So I can, if the client says I want an instrumental, I just turn the instrumental track that's already ready to go to record, and I can run it at the same time that I run my main mix, and in one pass create, if I want to, instrumental, TV version, a cappella version, main version uncompressed for the mastering engineer, all in one pass.
Okay, very cool. So, sometimes for those of us who aren't doing this yet, that might sound really complex to try, and it sounds like it can sound a little bit like trying to get the answer right to a very difficult math problem on, when you really need to start with 2 + 2.
Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't just make this up at once. It was the product. The template is the product of many, many, many years of sessions.
Yeah.
And fine tuning of that template.
So that's
why my template is now called template 5.7, because I keep making little minor revisions or bigger revisions.
Nice. Well, for us, for example, we might start by mixing and just sort of choosing some groups for our buses, like drums, bass, guitars, horns, keys, lead vocals, background vocals, and then those can just route straight to the 2-mix output. And then when we decide that we're ready to start learning how to print stems, we go below our session and start adding in these stem recording tracks. How would we get those other buses to the stems? the stem tracks.
Which other buses are you talking about?
Well, so let's see. I'm trying to visualize and also.
Oh, you mean the audio stems that I mentioned?
Yeah.
So basically, I've created, along with the bus tracks, I've also created audio tracks, and the audio tracks get the routing from the bus tracks, so that if I want to create a drum stem, I can just enable the drum stem audio track and record it, and it'll be the same thing that I'm bussing the drums to. See what I mean?
Yeah, so the drums are going to a bus track that's called drums, and then that bus track can also have an additional aux output that goes down to the audio track called drum stems.
Correct.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, because we're podcast, I have sort of over-explain it to try and visualize it at the same time.
Of course. Well, I think everything is in that Sonic Scoop, so I think if people want to really delve into that, they should watch that, and it has all the answers.
Absolutely. So in the meantime, we'll regale them with stories of it, in audio form.
Sure. No, I mean, because I can imagine it must be hard to wrap your head around it without a visual.
Yeah. Well, we enjoy talking about it anyway. So, another app that you talked about receiving the audio tracks and sort of getting everything ready. And you had another great tip. You reminded us that sometimes we get our sessions from Logic users and everything sort of shows up as stereo files, and you're like, and you start scratching your head and you're like, is everybody really recording stereo kick drums? What am I missing here?
Yeah, that's poor engineering on the part of the Logic users that do that. There's an app called Stereo Monoizer made by Soundizers, which I use for that. It's a great app. You basically, before you import in Pro Tools, you just drop everything in this app, and it basically lets you remove or turn every stereo track that's truly double mono, and it does check for that, into a mono track, and it drops one of the two sides. But it also, if there's a stereo track that's often in what happens in Logic is you create a pan of something that's mono. Let's say you're panning. Let's say you have a mono bass track, but you have it panned to one side ever so slightly. Mm-hmm. When you export your tracks from Logic, you will create a stereo file that has an identical signal of the bass on the left side and the right side, but one of the two sides is a little bit louder because of the pan that you forgot to disable in Logic before exporting your Logic tracks. Mm-hmm. And so this Soundizer, Stereo Monoizer software actually checks for that as well. It's very smart, and it sees, the left side is identical to the right side, but a little bit louder. So I'm going to drop the right side and give the left side output the left side. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic tool to deal with the sadness of the files we are sent.
And that's really handy because Pro Tools gives us the ability to take a stereo track and sort it out and turn it into a mono track, but it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah, you have to go into the menu, split the track into mono, and then you have to delete the stereo version and one of the mono versions. And also, you're doing that assuming that it's a mono version, that it's a dual mono file.
Yeah.
But you're making that assumption unless you do a test with a phase inversion, then you don't know that it's truly dual mono, or you're missing something.
Yeah. So, and then the real question nobody asks is, when you delete one of the two mono tracks, do you like to keep the left one or keep the right one?
Well, I use this Stereo Monoizer, which keeps the louder one if there is a louder one. And if there isn't, the software just outputs one. It doesn't output, any particular one.
Yeah.
If I'm doing it manually, I keep the left one just because I come from the keyboard days where left is mono.
Oh yeah, good point. You know what it feels like when inspiration hits and you want to capture your great song idea, but then the studio gets in the way and it's just no fun anymore. Wouldn't it feel awesome if you could simplify the process of producing your music from inspiration to final masterpiece? PreSonus Studio One is a powerful digital audio workstation that helps you compose your music with a complete collection of virtual instruments for keyboards and drums, MIDI tools for hip-hop, EDM, and film, a flexible sketchpad with chord charts and key recognition for songwriting and arranging, and classic effects pedals and amp simulators for guitar and bass. With 37 high-quality effects plugins, integrated Melodyne, and drag and drop flexibility, you can easily edit and polish your mixes. And Studio One is the only DAW with a built-in mastering studio so that you can take your record from writing to radio ready all in one place. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If you're using a Mac in your recording studio and you're tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly, then Otherworld Computing is the solution for you. OWC can help keep your existing Mac and studio current and relevant so that you can make great music. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac, you can get the most mileage out of your studio with OWC. Offering a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49, there's no need to get frustrated when you can achieve the speed to create and the capacity to dream at OWC.com. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now. My guest today is Marc Urselli joining us on the podcast, and we're going to jump into the second half of the show. Marc, we're talking about templates, and you mentioned a lot of interesting things in your templates: parallel compression, buses, stem routing. Let's talk a little bit about some of the parallel processing and effects that you find useful and ways to set those up. Watching the video, I noticed that you might have a track called, parallel drum compression or whatever, and then you seem to just sort of enable plugins that were already there. Can you talk about ways that you use that to be efficient and some things that we might take away as we develop our own templates?
Yeah, basically on the plugin, on the template, every track that I've pre-configured has plugins on them that are disabled, so that I can simply enable them if they need, if I want to use a certain plugin. So on the parallel compression tracks, I have all sorts of different compressors. For example, I like the 6060 Ultimate Module Collection made by Mac DSP, and also their 6050 Ultimate Channel Strip plugin, because it has so many different tonalities of plugins of compression available on one plugin. And so I basically just I go by taste of like, okay, in these drums, I want to do this kind of retro compression. So I might enable this kind of compressor versus another one. And I just try until I hear something I like. The retro compressor 4030 by Mac DSP, for example, is great for that kind of stuff. Okay.
So to understand, the why behind something like that, if we go to our plugins folder and we've got, I guess if we only had like a couple of plugins to choose from, that might be a pretty fast process. But pretty quickly, you end up with a lot of plugins in there, and it can become a very long list of stuff. And so what you've done is you've taken your favorites and you just put them in there so that you don't have to go look at this enormous list of plugins and try and remember the name of something and go find it hunting around, right?
Yeah, exactly. I have all my favorites, and they're already all ready to go on the Pro Tools track, except they're all disabled so that they don't take up DSP resources because they're disabled. So I just enable them based on which one I want to use. And so on my template, you'll see that every track has at least 5 plugins that are disabled, but only one is enabled, and that's the one that's working.
Okay, cool. And then would you, if you're mixing, Is it likely that you could actually have a bunch of tracks and stuff that are in your template that just aren't even enabled because you don't need them for this mix yet, but they're still there, and if
Correct.
you need them, you can use them if you want to?
Correct. I do that with all the parallel compression and all the 5.1 tracks and all the stem tracks, because not every client wants stems, so they're all disabled and not taking up DSP resources or screen resources, screen real estate. If they ask for stems, I just enable them, turn them on, and that's it. Same goes for 5.1 tracks, because almost nobody wants 5.1 mixes, and same goes for parallel compression, because I don't often do parallel compression. More times than not, I don't do it, and so they're disabled until I need them. Okay,
that's fascinating. What is it about parallel compression that makes you not want to use it all the time?
I just don't feel like it's. I think it's a trick, and as such, you should use it when you want to use a trick. It's not something that is a must. You don't have to have parallel compression for a track to sound great. I mean, it's a very creative way of mixing, and my philosophy very often is less is more. And so unless I want to get creative, or unless I'm trying to get to a place where the direct, so to speak, signal is not taking me, I don't need to do any extra trickery. Less is more.
Okay. Yeah, you actually had a funny quote on that Sonic Scoop presentation where you said, less is more, but if a client asks you for more snare, your answer isn't to give them less snare.
Exactly. That, yeah, and that's the truth. To me, less is more until it's not.
Okay. What are some things, though? Let's say you decide you want to use some parallel compression. How do I want to ask this question? What are some indicators to you that it is a good time to try using parallel processing on a track? And let's start with drums, for example.
There's not really something that I can put my finger on. It's like when you want to have more for example, okay, I'll try to say it this way. It's one of the times where parallel compression can be great is when you want to have more of something without turning up the volume. Another time when parallel compression is great is when you have a client that says, everything sounds great, but I just want it a little bit dirtier, for example. I've heard that before. And that's where sometimes I try parallel compression. It often comes up with people that are trying to sound older, like they're trying to mimic sounds of another era, but they've recorded everything so perfectly, pristinely that it doesn't sound, crunchy or old enough. Or crunchy is another thing I could mention when people want things to sound crunchier. That's another good candidate for trying parallel compression. Obviously, it all depends on how much parallel compression you do. I'm not saying it will always make it crunchy. I'm just saying that's one of the candidates.
Do you find that rock projects might call for it a little bit more than others?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely do it more on louder music than I'll do it on quiet jazz, for example.
Okay, all right. And you bring up an interesting point, which is with the quality of gear that people can get in home studios now, it would be very common to just have like a pretty clean sounding microphone going into a pretty clean sounding mic pre and just recording it that way, where everything that you do to process it is sort of inside the mix and inside the plugin if you don't have the outboard gear.
Yeah. And, also a lot of the plugins these days, especially the Waves plugins, already have the ability to do parallel compression. People don't even realize or understand really that that's what's happening. But when you see a dry versus mixed signal on something that isn't a reverb, that's really what it's doing. It's doing parallel compression if it's a dynamic plugin.
Yeah. How about bass? What are some things that come in useful when you want to do parallel processing on a bass track?
Kind of the same as drums. It's really about getting more presence out of something that's there, but you don't want to turn it up and make it louder. You just want to have more presence for it.
Okay, and it's just sort of bringing the mid-range and the harmonic content forward?
Yeah, I mean, which part of the range will come up heavily depends on what kind of tools you're using, whether you're doing parallel compression, before or after, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. What about effects? If we're kind of skipping past some of the parallel compression because we're not using it all the time, what sort of effects do we find very useful in a mix, and for which instruments, I guess?
You mean effects like reverb and stuff like that?
Yeah, stuff that's not a compression effect or a distortion effect.
I mean, obviously, reverb is the king of all effects, ambience in general. It gives you the opportunity to create a space around something that wasn't there when it was recorded, if you want to do that, if you didn't have any room mics or want to create a different kind of sonic space. I like reverbs, plugins made by Mac DSP, like the Revolver. I like the little plate made by Sound Toys. I love the effect rack made by Sound Toys. I also like the Space plugin by Avid. All of those are plugins that I use when I'm working in the box. When I'm working in the studio in the analog domain, I use two things primarily. One is an analog spring reverb called the Master Room 2, which is incredible, and I'm lucky to have one of them at EastSide Sound. It's about 4 feet tall. It's in the machine room. And then I use a Lexicon 480 as well for halls and stuff like that. Those are great. It's a digital reverb. I said analog domain because really I'm routing the signal in the analog domain from the console, even though it's a digital reverb.
Yeah, and plus you get this cool looking remote control to hold in your hand and
it's the famous white remote control that's on top of many consoles that you've seen in pictures. That's the one.
Yeah, so I actually have a single rack space Master Room reverb, spring reverb that I love here in the studio. I don't think it's much more like a spring reverb in a guitar amp, I think, than like the big ones.
Yeah, of course, because of the size as well. I didn't know that they made a rack version of it.
Yeah, it's called the XL121, if I'm reading it correctly across the room.
Okay.
But cool. It's super cool. I enjoy it, and it's got it also has a 1/4 inch jack on the front, so you can sort of plug a guitar straight in and out of it if you want to while you're.
Oh, that's amazing.
Control room.
Yeah, I'm looking at it online. I've never seen one of those units. That's nice. Great.
That was fast, man. You're pulling up browsers like that.
It's in front of me. I'm by the computer.
Yeah.
If you look at the one I have, is called MR2. MR is for Master Room. If you Google Master Room 2, you'll see a lot of pictures of bedrooms. But you'll see the second picture on Google is a picture of the actual unit from a studio.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So let me go back to a couple of things you mentioned. You talked about the Sound Toys rack, and that's just such a great reminder because I noticed that on your presentation, you talked about if I need a special effect, I might start with the Sound Toys rack. And it looked like maybe you had already racked it up with a bunch of interesting units. And it's such a great piece of gear because you can start out with a whole lot of options.
Yeah, correct. It's the same thing applies, that basically I have my favorite plugins. I also have my favorite settings or presets for every plugin. So when I said that I have plugins disabled and ready to go on the tracks, those plugins are already preloaded with my favorite presets. So I can enable a plugin and it will have a preset that I like. And so I have 2 tracks in my template that I call FX1 and FX2 for special effects of any kind. And of those I have, I think 2 or 3 different instances of the effect track, not because I need 2 or 3 in a row, because I have them preloaded with 2 or 3 of my favorite presets that I can start from. I can always change, and I do always change, but it's a good starting point.
Okay, and then within an effects rack, there might be even 5 different pieces of gear in there of Sound Toys effects. And do you just bypass the ones you don't need and sort of enable the one that you want to use, or would you?
I mean, the effect rack is so deep and so extensive as a plugin that I usually start with their presets, with the Sound Toys preset that it comes preloaded with, and I change things around according to what I want to do, basically, or how I want it to sound.
It's funny because I have the rack, and I'm usually using those plugins as individuals, and I completely forgot that the rack itself has presets for the rack.
Oh, yeah. And they're incredible. I love them.
I need to go back and check that out.
They're really my go-to special effect kind of plugin,
Yeah. If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you're going to need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortions. This is my voice right now on the new Amethyst microphone with Class A discrete amplifier circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and advanced built-in shock mount technology to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst microphone at jzmic.com. During the height of record making, Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and the New York City record plant all turned to one company to build their consoles. That company is now Spectra 1964, carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. The extremely stable, high-speed circuit design of the 101 amplifier provides unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier, dynamic recordings. Spectra 1964 brings you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and so many more. Created by the missile engineers who are central in rolling out the systems that protected the free world for over half a century, Spectra 1964 literally brings rocket science to your studio. With the STX 600 mic pre with built-in comp limiter, full-frequency passive BBDI, and C610 dedicated comp limiter, start making records that last a lifetime at Spectra1964.com. Okay, very cool. Let's see. Let's talk about vocals for a moment. What are some things that you find very useful to do as far as, how you would treat a vocal when you're mixing it? Are there things that, you do so many genres. I know for a lot of us, we're doing stuff that might be leaning towards rock and pop and hip hop and stuff. And so one of our challenges is trying to make sure that the vocal is just sitting out front of the mix in the right kind of way. Any tricks you want to share with us about making sure that we're, effectively doing that?
Good signal in the recording is the most important thing. And by good signal, I mean not just level, but I also mean absence of room in the vocal sound, because that's the one thing that will create problems for you down the line. If you're trying to have that up close sound that everyone loves in vocals, but you have this roominess around the vocal that you can't get rid of, or that gets exacerbated when you have a compressor on it, for example. That's your number one enemy. And to reduce that, I try to use in the studio. I try to use the right room for the right vocal. So depending on the genre, I'll put people in a bigger or smaller room. But also there's great shields. I use one made by Aston, the company that makes Aston mics. They have this purple shield called the Halo, I think, which is great. I know SE makes one too. And for people that work that record vocals at home, there's this IsoVox portable vocal booth that basically is a box that you stick your head in with a microphone and a light.
Oh, right. I heard about those. Yeah,
I've never used it myself, but I have a friend in Italy that has one of those in his bedroom, basically, and it's amazing. He let me stick my head in, and I was amazed by how quiet it is. I was amazed.
Do you remember the old TV show Get Smart and the Cone of Silence?
Not sure I do, because I grew up in Europe, so I don't think we had
it was a silly American show, but
yeah,
they used to try and get in there and have conversations, and it never worked, so they'd have to lean outside of it to talk to each other. But
okay.
I like that. And so what's encouraging to me is that your answer isn't you can only get a great vocal if you're in a perfect room in a pro studio. You're saying that if the sound of the room isn't right, you can still treat it to get the sound of the recording right.
Yes, yes and no. I'm saying that you should choose the proper sounding room for the vocal. And if you cannot choose a room, if you don't have the option of trying different rooms, then you can resort to something like the Aston Halo or that Isobox 2, whatever it's called.
Yeah. And then do you find that treatments to try and make the room quieter with the mic tend to be okay if the treatment is behind the mic, or do they sort of need to be behind the singer as well?
That depends on the size of the room and on the materials of the room. If you're recording, in a closet, basically, you're going to have so much reflections from behind that you should try to have absorption behind the singer as well.
Yeah, put a lot of clothes in the closet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't have to deal with that because I'm lucky enough to work in a professional studio where these issues have been addressed when the studio was built. But I have come across many recordings that I haven't done myself that were sent to me for mixing, where I can clearly hear the reflection of glass from a vocal booth or the reflection of something else. And it's really annoying because, unless you do things like deverb it, which you can do with a plugin, but it's never that great sounding because you can hear the artifacts. And when you're dealing with something that's so up in your face and up close like the vocal, it becomes obvious. It's very important to record it right from the get-go. That's true for every instrument, but vocals being up front is more important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when I first heard about the idea of hearing reflections, it sounds very mysterious. And then when you begin to understand what they actually sound like, you start hearing it and stuff, and you're like, oh, I really hear that.
Yeah, and it drives you crazy.
It does.
You have to know what to listen for, of course, but yeah.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about your template. You also have two different tracks that you print. You sort of have the mix, and then you had this one that you send to the client, right? Can you talk about what those are all about?
Yeah, I have two. I print two mixes. One is uncompressed, and it's for the mastering engineer, and the other one is compressed with a similar compression, multi-band compression to that a mastering engineer would apply, and that's basically the reference track that I give to the client to hear what the mix will sound like more or less once it's mastered.
Do you have any guidelines for how we can set that up to have the, what do we put on the mastered one to make it sound mastered for the client?
Well, you can use whatever multi-band compression or limiter or compressor you want to use. That's really up to you. I like the Mac DSP ML4000 and the Mac DSP ML8000, which are a 4-band and 8-band multi-band compressor and limiter. I use those two depending on how many bands I want. And what's important to say is that I also monitor through it to make sure that what I'm doing translates properly. But I'll always print the uncompressed version as well, because that's what you want to give your mastering engineer.
Okay. And then are there any guidelines for how much louder we should make the mix for the client? Is there a guideline for that, or do we just sort of try a couple of settings until we arrive at something that seems like it's working?
I will say these two mixes are the only time where I use my eyes rather than my ears. I'm a very big advocate for using your ears over your eyes, but when it comes to those two mixes, I look at them and I know what to look for. If I'm seeing a squared off wave in the one that's going to the mastering engineer, then that means I have to review my signal chain and make sure I'm not hitting too hard. But the squared off wave is probably what it's going to come out from the mastering engineer, depending on the genre, of course. So on the one that's going to the client as a reference, I'm okay with having a little bit of squaring off, because I know that's what it's going to be after, and I want them to hear what it's going to be like.
Okay, and we're talking about also the fact that when you print these mixes, you like to print them on tracks inside your Pro Tools session. So you, rather than use the bounce feature of Pro Tools, you actually print them to tracks, and then once it's printed, then you can see immediately what the visual of the mix looks like.
Correct. I never use the bounce feature. I have nothing against the bounce feature. You can use the bounce and import after the bounce, but why would you do that? Because when you have to do two things. You have to bounce and then you have to import, which is, an extra step. And the other very important reason why I print in the Pro Tools session is because sometimes I want to address just a specific part and I don't have to reprint the entire song. Now, if you're dealing with 3-4 minute songs, it's not a big deal to reprint the whole thing. But I also have mixed orchestras or operas that are 120 minutes long or 80 minutes long. And if the client wants a change at minute 45, that's only going to be a change for 30 seconds. Why would I sit there and re-listen to the whole thing or even run it in non-real time if it's all in the box when I can just reprint those 30 seconds? Meaning I record on the print tracks the 30-second section that has a change, and then I just crossfade into the print track and consolidate.
Yeah, that makes sense. And some other benefits I think are the fact that, like you said, you can visually see where the print is. It's sometimes now of course Pro Tools has a bounces folder, and so you know where to find your bounces. But there have been times in the past where it's been quite comforting to know that your mix is inside that audio files folder, safe and sound. And then also, I think Craig Alvin, when he was on the show, he pointed out that he might put a reference track on that same print track, and then you can go in and out. Or the last mix you did.
Oh, absolutely.
You just go in and out of input, and you're hearing it, comparing your mix.
I absolutely do that. I can go in and out to compare to the old and the new, and I also make playlists. So for every new revisions that I make, I make a new playlist. In fact, if you look at that Sonic Scoop, you'll see that not only do I have playlists, but I have the name of the track already named in a way that when I create a playlist, the incremental number added by the playlist becomes the revision number. So to be more specific, let's say the song is called Love. I will call my track Love space V.01, so that when I make a new playlist on that track, without me having to type anything, the next playlist will be called Love space V.02. In other words, version 2 of the song Love. Yeah,
which is great because then your naming is staying consistent with the session.
Absolutely.
And
every version that I do has the name of the song, has the version number, and also has a C or an NC. That's just my own way of naming compressed versus non-compressed tracks, so I always know what I'm looking at.
So there's one other thing that I haven't experienced, but I've been thinking about. I've been using, training myself to use reference plugins where you can check your mix against different plugins, and sometimes they have these features like they'll do level matching for you, and they might do other fancy stuff, which is all very cool. But you still have to pull up a plugin window and go click on the plugin window. And if you're doing the print to a track and you want to check it against the last mix you did, all you're going to have to hit is whatever Option K on your keyboard, and that's probably the only track that's going in and out of input, unless I guess you're printing stems too or something like that. But it seems like no matter where you are while you're working in Pro Tools, you could be one key click away from checking your reference track, which could be really handy.
Yeah, I always do that. And the other thing I do is on my mix track, I make another playlist. The only playlist that will have a different name, I call that rough. And if the client gave me a rough mix to listen to, I put that there so I can click in and out of the rough mix and compare my mix to their rough mix.
Okay, now here's the question that nobody ever asks. How do you like to spell rough when you spell it? I always put R-U-F-F.
No, I spell it in English.
All right. Okay, cool. I know you do a lot of great jazz albums, so I thought if it's all right with you, I might talk to you a little bit about how you get some of the sounds for those.
Of course.
Let's start with one of the challenging instruments that you might find on a jazz album, and of course, you're a keyboard player. So piano, for example, if you're doing a piano recording and you're doing multiple mics, could you talk a little bit about some of the choices you might make for where you want to place the microphones for a contemporary jazz record? Maybe let's say the piano is it's the pianist's jazz trio or quartet. So you want a full stereo piano sound. And then also, could you talk about some of the ways that you make sure that the phase and polarity between those mics are all working well together?
Yeah. So for piano, I've refined my way of recording it through the years. I used to record it with some Neumanns initially. Then I moved on to a pair of KSM 32s because I wanted a little bit more transience and brilliance than the Neumann 2 mics. And now I found my new favorite piano mic, which is a Erland EHR-M. Erland is a Swedish company that makes microphones that have a triangular diaphragm. So they're great for transients, and they have a fantastic low end that none of those other mics that I was using were able to offer on a piano.
Wow.
And so I bought a pair of those EHR-Ms, and they've become my piano mic. I record them through an API 512C or 3124, which are basically the same preamp housed in a lunchbox or in a 4-channel version. And usually I record the piano with just those 2 mics, so a low and a high, a left hand and a right hand microphone. When I want to get fancier, or the piano player wants me to get fancier, or it's a solo piano record, I usually add a second pair of microphones, or a third microphone, which is a stereo mic. So I always end up with 4 channels. That second mic is a HUM, H-U-M, which is a Polish company. They make this fantastic stereo ribbon mic, which I love, and I put that at the tail end of the piano to pick up even more of the low end if I want to mix it in, or I put it a little bit further away from the piano. So the main piano mics, the EHR-Ms by Erland, are about a foot away from the strings of the piano in the proximity of the hammers. And then the other, whatever I use as the second mic, which is usually the HUM, is at the tail of the piano. What else can I say about that? Oh yeah, and for aligning phase, I use a plugin called M-Auto Align, which is made by Melda Productions, a great plugin company that I love and endorse. And the last thing I want to say, also I did a solo piano record with Jack DeJohnette for a jazz label called Nouvelle Records that I've been working with for 5 or 6 years. And he was a Shure endorser, and therefore required me to use Shure microphones. And it was a solo piano record. So with him, I actually used 2 KSM 32s on the hammers. Then I used, I believe, a pair of KSM 44s about 3-4 feet away from the piano. And then I used a Shure VP88, which is a stereo mic made by Shure, even further away from the piano to pick up more room sound. And interestingly, that piano recording has kind of become, in the jazz and audiophile world, a benchmark for great piano sounding piano
Right on.
sounds.
Congrats on that, man. That's a big accomplishment. It would be hard to describe in one sentence what gives records a legendary sound, but it would be easy to describe in 3 letters: API. For more than 50 years, API Audio has created large format consoles for world-class studios. Famous for co-founder Saul Walker's circuit designs and the original 2520 op-amp, the sound of API consoles is the sound of great music. API now brings that legendary sound to your home studio with the Box, a small format console featuring the famous API circuitry that is the perfect analog addition for your digital studio. The Box gives you 8 recording channels on the left with built-in mic pre's, high-pass filters, direct inputs, and custom loadable 500 module slots, and 16 summing channels on the right, or mix using all 24 channels, including aux sends, inserts, and silky smooth faders, feeding a master section with classic API compression, switchable monitor sends, and a Pro TalkBack switch, and you've just upgraded your studio to legend status with the Box from APIaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. So the M Auto Align, that kind of basically takes these mics and it time aligns them so that they're in phase coherency?
Correct. Does exactly that. It's kind of like the Sound Radix plugin that does the same thing. But I'm a Melda Production endorser, and I love their plugin bundle. I think it's called the Ultimate Bundle, and their plugin works perfectly. And I use it on things like piano, and I definitely use it on drums a lot.
Okay. I'd love to talk more about that because it's one of those areas that I've explored a little bit, but I never really, I wasn't sold on it yet, or I think I just didn't know what I was doing well enough yet.
Well, it doesn't always work. Sometimes I've had, and it's not the plugin's fault. I mean, sometimes I put it on tracks, and what it does, it has a bypass function that you can click in and out. Mm-hmm. And I've listened, and sometimes every time I put it on, I listen to the bypass version and the non-bypass version. And sometimes, whether it's perfectly in phase or not, the bypass version sounds better to my ears. And I always go with my ears.
Yeah, good choice. When we want to use something like this, if we just have 2 tracks, how does a phase align plugin work? I mean, how do you put it on both tracks and you make the plugins talk to each other or something like that? What's a typical setup for that? Yeah,
you put it on whichever tracks you want to phase align. And it you basically click analyze in this particular one. And it does that. It does it all automatically. You don't have to make the plugins talk to each other. They talk to each other automatically. What you can do is if you're using it on multiple tracks of different instruments in the same sessions, say I want to phase align my drums, but also my piano or my bass, which is where I often use it. And it's even more important on the bass, I would argue. Then you can create groups. You create a drum group, and I don't mean Pro Tools groups. These are groups within the plugin. So you create a drum group and a bass group and a piano group, and you have to analyze, click analyze three times on those groups so that it does. And you have to be playing Pro Tools to analyze, obviously. And it does just that. It does it beautifully and automatically. The one thing that I can add is that on the old version, you'd have to click analyze on the track that you wanted to use as your primary guide track, so to speak. So in the case of a drum set, you would do it on a snare drum because it's the loudest and first transient. Mm-hmm. But now they figured out a way where you don't even have to do it on a specific guide track. You just analyze and it does it all automatically.
That's pretty cool. I'm going to have to revisit that for sure. And I like the idea that you could just simply put it across all your drum tracks, hit a button, and then see which one you like better.
Absolutely. It's very easy.
So if I followed you there, you would be time aligning the drums, then you'd be time aligning the bass, between the DI and the amp or whatever you've got. And then
we should say phase aligning because it's different than time aligning.
Okay.
Yeah, time aligning adds delays, basically. Delays all the signal. Phase aligning is slightly different.
Okay. All right. So it phase aligns each group separately, and then is it phase aligning the two groups to work well together as well?
No, the two groups. There wouldn't be a reason to phase align drums with bass or piano.
Okay. All right.
That's just in your mix, but it's important with the bass because obviously the first thing that out of phaseness, if that's a word, does is loss of low end. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important in the bass. I always check out of phase polarity when I add a DI, which I obviously almost always do with an electric bass. I'll record a DI and a mic. But the M-Auto Align plugin goes even deeper into the phase alignment. It doesn't just check the out of phase as in the polarity switch, which is 180 degrees. It does it within that 180 degrees and puts it fully in phase, which means absolutely no loss of low end information.
Very cool. Now I know you often work in studio situations where you have some pretty nice monitors set up properly. For those of us who might just be starting out and wanting to explore this stuff in just a pair of headphones, are we going to be able to hear this low-end alignment going on as well, just in headphones?
You should. Clearly, it depends on the headphones. Mm-hmm. But if you have a good pair of headphones, then you should absolutely hear that loss of low end.
Let's stay on the topic of bass for just a moment. Another thing that I know can be very challenging to record well is upright bass. And I think you have a lot of experience doing that. So I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about some of the best ways to get a really great upright bass sound.
Sure. My favorite way I actually learned from one of my mentors, Lou Holtzman, who is the owner and founder of EastSide Sound. And he taught me this way of recording bass with two microphones. One is a small diaphragm pencil condenser, and I suspend that in the bridge of the upright bass with two rubber bands, usually courtesy of the mailman. Those thick, nice rubber bands that the U.S. Postal Service uses for the mail. Uh-huh. And then I use a large diaphragm tube mic, usually on the outside of the bass, pointed usually at the F hole, about a foot and a half away. Those two signals I mix together. And with those two signals, you can pretty much get any kind of bass sound you ever wanted, because you can get the attack and the definition from the pencil mic that's pointed upwards towards the fingerboard. And then you can get the boominess and the low end and the whole body of the instrument through the large diaphragm pointed at the F hole. If I want to add a third channel, it'll be either a DI if the bass player insists or wants me to, or is a singer for whatever reason. Or I'll add there's a company from Denmark that I have started using a couple of years ago. They're called Remic, and they make mics that are specific for stringed instruments like violin, viola, cello, and upright bass. And I have one of each of those. They're dual. There's very, very tiny two microphones inside this microphone that's shaped like a foam triangle that goes between the tailpiece of the bass and the body of the bass. And so that's a third signal if you want to have a third one.
Okay, so I'm trying to picture this pencil microphone. So the bridge on an upright bass is tall, and there's actually a little space underneath the bridge. And is that where the mic is sort of suspended, looking upwards?
Correct. It's suspended. I take usually a Neumann KM184 or an Octava MCO12. Those are my favorite small diaphragm condensers. And then you slide it in between the hole of the bridge. And then to suspend it there, you put rubber bands around the mic and around the bridge and around the mic again from either side. So it's basically the same thing. The bridge of the upright bass becomes like a shock mount for the microphone.
That's great, man. What a great takeaway. And Rockstars, I want to point out something that's exciting for you is Marc just listed a bunch of very wonderful microphones that probably are an investment for your studio, but he also just listed one that you could just go out and get right now, which is the Octava MC12 or MK. Is it MK12?
I think it's MCO12.
MCO12, yeah.
It's $100 mic or something like that. And it's great. I've used it I've used that. Actually, you're right. It's MKO12. I was just Googling it to be sure. I've used that microphone for a decade before I bought a pair of KM184s. Now I use the KM184s, which obviously Neumann's can't go wrong. But, either way, they're great microphone. And my mic outside is usually either a Neumann FET 47 or something like that.
And then I'm not sure if they still exist, but the Octava Mod was a company that would take your Octava mics and sort of do these modifications on them too, very affordably. Okay, my internet's not pulling up. I can't Google as fast as you can during a live podcast. But just
I'm Googling it. The Octava Mod. I've never used them, but are you talking about the Michael Jolie?
Maybe. I don't know enough about him.
Actually, yeah. Actually, it's funny because it just came up as the third Google result. And I've never used Michael Jolie myself, but I know somebody who has and was very happy with it. He's this guy in Cape Cod, Massachusetts that makes mods based on old Octavas. You can go to octavamodshop.com and you'll read about Michael Jolie.
Okay, cool. Let's see. I guess the last question I would ask about recording jazz is drum miking and how you like to record a drum kit. Is there anything you want to talk about in that department? Maybe how is recording a jazz drum kit maybe different from other sessions and rock sessions and things like that?
Yeah, I treat drum recording pretty similarly across all genres in the sense that I want to have close mics and I want to have room mics. On the rock sessions, room mics are much more important than on jazz sessions. On the jazz sessions, oftentimes you end up not using them, especially if it's a quiet session with a lot of brushes. The main differences are number one in the kick drum the kick drum mic that I will choose. Jazz sessions, oftentimes they don't want a very pointy or attacky kick drum sound. Oftentimes they don't even have a hole in the skin of the bass drum. Mm-hmm. And so I will use a mic that's a little bit more conducive to the genre, an RE20, made by Electro Voice. Whereas on a rock or funk session where you want more of that attacky kick drum mic, I will use a Sennheiser E602, which if you look at the frequency response of that mic, it does have a little bit of a boost around like between 4 and 6K, which is exactly what gives you that clicky, attacky sound for a kick drum, which is great. The other microphone that I've recently started using is the Lewitt kick drum mic called DTP340. And the great thing about that mic is that it has a large diaphragm and a small diaphragm condenser built inside the one mic. You plug one mic in, it comes out with two XLRs, and you have the full bodied sound from the large diaphragm and the attack from the pencil mic, and they're perfectly in phase because they're built within the same microphone with no space between them. And I've been loving that microphone on kick drums as well.
And then you can just sort of blend between the two inside Pro Tools on the console.
When you mix, you blend how much attack you want versus how much body you want. And that just basically is a one mic solution for what often, especially in the rock world, becomes a kick drum mic'd up with at least 2 or 3 microphones. Oftentimes, along with the Sennheiser E602, which I mentioned, which is a cheap mic around $150, I'll also use a Shure SM91 on the floor in front of the mic, or on the floor in front of the kick drum, or inside the kick drum on top of a pillow, or I'll use a FET 47 sometimes if it's not too loud of a drummer that will damage the Neumann. That's pretty much for kick drums. Snare and toms, I treat the same way across the genres. Snare microphones, SM57s. Bottom mic is usually for me an SM81 condenser mic, so I can get a little bit more of the brush of the snares in the snare. Tom mics, I use MD421s religiously. I love all versions of them. I own some of the vintage ones at EastSide Sound, the white ones, but also the newer black ones are great sounding. Hi-hat, I can give you my take on it. I've used different mics on the hi-hat, and the one that I've ended up using as a Microtech Gefell. It's a great
70.
No, it's not the 70. I think it's the M940. It's a pretty expensive mic for a hi-hat, so it's not going to be everyone's. It's not going to be on everyone's list. I think it's almost like $1,800, and it kind of seems like overdoing it for a hi-hat mic. But I just found that it's the sound that I like the most. I've also used Bayer M160s, which are small ribbon mics on hi-hats. They also sound great. And then for overheads, I use a pair of 414s. And the main difference there between jazz and rock is that on a jazz record, I'll get closer to the cymbals so that I have more definition in the ride, which is so important in the swing rhythms of a jazz session. Yeah. Whereas on the rock session, I'll be a little bit further up, so you can get more of an overall sound of the drums, and so that the drummer doesn't accidentally hit them with sticks. I feel, and this goes into mixing more than recording, but I feel that when you're mixing, a lot of what is your sound of the toms really comes from the overheads, which is the reason why I want to be with my overheads above the drums in a pretty symmetrical way. B, I never low cut or high pass the overheads on the mic itself. I will do it a little bit on the tracks when I mix, but I don't want to miss out on all that low end that's being recorded on the mic when it goes to tape, because that's going to make part of my tom sound. And so on a rock session, I won't be as aggressive. Like, I won't cut at 300 like many people do, because they just want to catch the cymbals. I actually want to hear some of the toms in those mics.
I think of 300 as so high for cutting.
Yeah, it's too aggressive. I mean, it can work if you're doing jazz and you just want to get the sizzle of the cymbals. But if you're doing rock and you want the vibration and the resonance of the toms that you're missing out on the close mic'd MD421s or whatever you use on the tom mics, you're going to get all of that on the overheads.
Yeah, my recent mix that I've been working on this past week, I did sort of a Glyn Johns miking, and the energy of the drums are all coming from those two overhead mics. And if I try and swap them out with the close tom mics, it doesn't feel the same at all.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very much a part of it.
Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Here are just some of the things students are saying about the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass.
Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process I have ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour lesson.
David P.
Thanks for a great session, dude. Just when I needed the inspiration.
John F.
A true feat of greatness. It was really life-changing and worth way more than I paid.
Mark R.
I've literally watched it 2 times at length, taken a plethora of notes, then coned back over some sections even more. You guys really knocked it out of the park on this one, and it was so incredibly eye-opening and useful immediately. What else can I say?
Shane J.
Amazing masterclass with Craig Alvin. My biggest takeaway was the concept of adding a subtle combination of distortion and compression to achieve a buttery cohesion in the sound. But there is so much more.
Steve K. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. Can you talk about some of the spacing, the mic spacing choices you would use for those 414s? What sort of, is it sort of like a wide space pair? Is it sort of, how do you get the right kind of stereo image when you put those up there?
If I'm doing rock, I'm basically being symmetrical with the kick drum. So I just use the kick drum as the middle of the drum set and put the overheads above the kick drum spaced about 2 feet away from each other.
If I'm pointing straight down at the drums?
Pointing down or slightly outwards so that there's more separation between them. Okay. If I'm doing a jazz session, then I'll go wider with them so the one above the ride is really above the ride and not really above the rack tom, so to speak, if you know what I mean.
I see. So the rock one can get in, the mics can be closer together.
Yeah, you can put them out. You can put them wider if you want, but I'm trying to get what's important is with the rock one, I'm being absolutely symmetrical, whereas on the jazz one, I am being more focused on the instrument that's going to be the main focus of that overhead mic, which is going to be the ride and the crash.
Yeah.
Most jazz drummers will only have 2 crashes and a ride, or even 1 crash and a ride, and so you kind of point them above those.
Okay. I want to go back to the hi-hat for just a sec. You talked about these mic choices. What about placement? Like what are useful places to put the hi-hat mic so that you're getting something that you want when it comes time to mix?
I just put it right above the hi-hat, about 3-4 inches away from the hi-hat. I put it on the other side of the playing side so that the drummer doesn't hit it. That's really it. No rocket science.
Pointed straight down to the hi-hat, or pointed sort of angled over towards where the snare drum is, or sort of towards
I pointed straight at the top part of the hi-hat cymbals. If anything, I try to place it so that the backside of the mic is pointed at the crash, and so that basically there's as little of the crash in the hi-hat mic as possible.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really, I do that with kind of all the microphones. I try to always think about the rear side of the mic as much as I think of the front side. Obviously, the front side, you point at what you want to record, but you decide how to angle it based on what's behind the mic.
Okay, cool. Well, Marc, we're getting near the end of the podcast, but I wanted to also give you a chance to talk about any of the projects that you've been working on recently that have been exciting for you. I know you've worked with an incredible list of artists. I don't even know where to begin, so I thought I'd just let you lead us. What are you excited about these days in the studio?
There's a lot that I'm excited about. There's a record coming out, which I guess when this podcast will come out, will have been out by then. And it's a tribute record to T-Rex that I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years with incredible musicians like U2, Foo Fighters, Nick Cave, so many others.
Wow.
It's produced by Hal Wilner, who's a mentor and a friend to me, who sadly passed away of coronavirus symptoms in April of this year. He was a true inspiration to me and many others. He was the kind of person that brought together the most incredible artists on one album. That was his gift and his specialty. I worked with him for over 10 years. He was also the producer of Lou Reed, which is how I met him. And that album should be out sometimes this year before this podcast comes out.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's a loss for everyone. Very sad loss. I actually put together a little website called haltribute.com, which I encourage you to visit if you don't know who Hal Wilner is, because not only will you understand how influential his impact in music worldwide was, but also you get to listen to the discography, which is super extensive, over 160 titles. His first record that he produced was a Fellini soundtrack record that's now already 40 years old, and which helped launch the career of people like Bill Frisell, for example. Hal Wilner was one of the first to hire Bill Frisell. Hal Wilner was also who discovered Jeff Buckley, just to give you a name that's more known or less, more known to everyone. Anyway, check out haltribute.com and listen to the discography, and you'll see how amazing Hal Wilner was. That's the one thing I'm really excited about. Then I'm mixing the new season of Nouvelle Records albums. So to give you a quick introduction to Nouvelle, they're a jazz label from Paris with an office in New York. They have this interesting subscription-based business model where you basically pay a yearly fee and you get 6 records in the mail, one every 2 months, and the records are exclusively vinyl. They're limited editions. They don't exist in download or CD version. So your only way to get it is to pay the yearly fee. They're very, they're beautifully packaged, and this is an audiophile kind of label. So I record everything at 32-bit and 96K, and everything is super duper high, quality.
Nice.
And we've done great records with them at EastSide Sound for 5 years. And this year, for the first time, they've decided to do a different take on it and record a lot of great artists in New Orleans, like Irma Thomas, Ellis Marsalis, who sadly also just passed away 2 weeks ago of coronavirus.
Wow, I didn't hear about Ellis. I saw him perform in Nashville. It was one of the most incredible shows I ever saw.
Yeah, he died just a week before Hal Wilner, I believe, in April or late March. And that was the last recording of Ellis Marsalis with his son playing vibraphone alone.
Wow.
And so that's going to come out. I don't know the release schedule for Nouvelle, but I'm mixing that record now. It's a beautiful record, and it's been recorded in New Orleans at Esplanade Studio. Other artists on that label is the Treme Brass Band that you know from the TV series, or Little Freddie King. There's just amazing artists, and so I'm mixing all of those records right now for next year's release schedule of Nouvelle. Those are just some of the things that I've been doing.
That's pretty amazing. Amazing stuff. Did you say that you recorded Ellis as well, or you're mixing it?
I didn't go to New Orleans for this series. So they used an engineer from Esplanade Studios. Previous to this, I had recorded all 5 years of releases by Nouvelle at EastSide Sound. This is the first time, like I said, that they recorded somewhere else. But I'm their mixing engineer.
Okay.
So I'm mixing all the records.
Okay. One of the things I remember about watching Ellis perform is he just made the thickest chords. His chord voicings were just incredibly dense and rich.
Yeah. No, it's been great to record, to mix that record. And actually, speaking of piano, that record has, I believe, 8 or 10 microphones on the piano. So it's plenty of sonic texture.
Did you try out the phase alignment
I did,
for that?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would say that the more mics on the same instrument, the more important it is that they're in phase. And so, yeah, I've definitely been phase aligning those.
Incredible. Okay, well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I've got one more question for you before we close out. This one is hypothetical, but and I like to ask this of all our guests, Marc. But we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you go back and you find young 17-year-old Marc Urselli starting out his first studio, and you say, "Listen, dude, I've come from the future and I want to give you this bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day." What advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
Good question. I think just be patient, listen and learn. Be patient, listen and learn is the one thing that you don't know when you're young. Yeah. And you realize later you should have.
Yeah, good advice. A lot of listening happens in a career and making records.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, I'm not talking listening to music is clearly number one, but I'm also talking about listening to people and listening to their way of thinking, their way of working, their advice, their ideas.
Great advice. Well, Marc, thank you for joining us on the podcast. Can you let the rock stars know where they could go to find out more about you? Where should they go discover you and your studio and your music? Anything else you want them to go check out?
Yeah, absolutely. My website is www.marcurseli.com, and my first and last name are spelled Marc, U-R like Robert, S like Sam, E-L-L-I. So it's marcurseli.com. And that's also all my social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn are all at marcurseli.com. That's really the easiest way to find out about me. You can also check out EastSide Sound, my studio in New York, online at eastsidesound.nyc. And you can check out Hal Tribute, the website I did for Hal to collect all of his tributes and discography, haltributes.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I have no more room on my piece of paper to take notes. I've completely filled it up and it's spilling over the edges. So It's been a really awesome interview and great to hang with you, man. And we'll be listening to this looking back months after when we do the interview, and hopefully we'll all still be healthy and well, and we'll be looking back on this in hindsight thinking, boy, that was an awful and strange time, but glad we're through it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Marc. We'll talk to you soon. We'll see you around the studio.
Okay, take care.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, JZ Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.